Well, welcome into the Storycraft Cafe, where I am your host, Hank Garner, and today, super excited. Joining us today in the Cafe is Linwood Barclay, a New York Times bestselling author with more than 20 novels to his credit. Linwood spent 3 decades in newspapers before turning full time to writing thrillers. His books have been translated into more than 2 dozen languages, sold millions of copies, and he counts Stephen King among his fans. Many of his books have been optioned for film and TV. A series has been made in France, and he wrote the screenplay for the film based on his novel Never Saw It Coming. Back in the U.S., born in the U.S., excuse me, his parents moved to Canada just as he was turning 4, and he's lived there ever since.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show, Linwood.
Thanks very much. And since that bio was done, there's been a second TV series in France, which aired about 3 weeks ago. And
Nice.
apparently did quite well. I still haven't seen it. I don't know. Maybe they'll send it to me. I don't know.
The life of a writer, right?
Yes.
Your brand new book, Whistle, came out a week ago today.
Right.
I have been a longtime fan of your work, and so I have certain expectations when a new Linwood Barclay book comes out, and I, kind of know what to expect. I did not know what I was getting into with Whistle, and I was pleasantly surprised. Surprised nonetheless, but I trusted you enough to take me on this journey to new territory, and I'm so glad I did.
Thank you.
If your book Elevator Pitch did for elevators what Jaws did for the beach, I'll be terrified to ride a train ever again after reading Whistle.
Well, you won't want to set up your toy train around the Christmas tree anymore. As I've said I've said that Whistle, I'm hopeful, will do for toy trains what Chucky did for dolls. And you're correct. You were probably surprised. This book is a bit of a departure. Most of my other thrillers, save for maybe Look Both Ways, have been rooted very much in a sort of real world, and when they're thrillers, mysteries, all those plots have to fit together like a Swiss watch. They have to make sense. But Whistle has, unlike the other books, has the added elements of sort of horror and supernatural, which is new for me to do. And in that sense, it was a little liberating because I could do things that I just didn't have to explain. Or I didn't have to account for my actions. So it's a different kind of a book. And I've been thinking, it didn't seem fair to me that in the horror genre, dolls and rocking horses and little mechanical monkeys get to create mayhem. Why can't toy trains be scary? And so that's what I set out to do here.
So I understand that you write novels to support your toy train habit. Is that true?
Yes, it can get expensive.
I think I saw a video on YouTube, and I'll link it in the show notes where you gave a glimpse into your toy train, and toy is not a great descriptor.
And those of us who are in this nerdly world of model trains, there's a kind of a distinction between sort of model trains and toy trains.
Right.
Toy trains are kind of Lionel and American Flyer, and they're lots of fun, but they're not quite as realistic, and they're larger, and and take a lot of abuse because we got them as little kids. Whereas model trains are sort of more precise and tend to be more realistic and so forth. So what I have in my basement in a room about 18 feet square is a model railway that strives to look kind of very real and so forth, as opposed to the Lionel kind of trains, which I have loved and have that period too, which are a little, they look more toy-like, at least some of them do. And so I didn't think that I could make the sort of model trains, the sort of precise ones, I didn't think there was a way to make them as scary as toy trains, because toy trains, to me, there's also attached to them is more a sense of innocence and play.
Right.
And I thought to make them evil, I thought would make more sense.
Well, and you use the word innocence. There's a toy trains can be taken out of the box, put a a circular track together in 30 minutes
Sure.
and you can be playing,
Right.
whereas model trains like you have, where you have these whole cities built, there's a little more intention there, and there's something about um, the off the cuff, immediate nature of toy trains that can
Yeah.
be kind of spun up in a hurry.
Yeah, you can get them out of the box and get them going in no time. And
Yeah,
whereas the model railway in our current house where we live now, every time, if you're a model train guy like me, you have to tear down a layout when you move and start from scratch when you get somewhere else. You build according to your room configuration.
sure.
And so this one in our house, we started in May of 2019. And I'm still working on it. The last sort of extensive bit of work I did was last fall. And you can go for long periods and do nothing. I did a ton of work on it during the pandemic.
Yeah.
A lot of it got
Oh,
done,
I can imagine.
but model railways are kind of never done. Whereas a toy train thing can be set up and taken down, and set up again at Christmas or whatever.
Right, right. Um, you mentioned that you've written more than 20 thrillers that are based in reality, and when you're writing a thriller, you or a mystery, or that there's a certain grounding that
Yeah,
has to take place. That there are it needs um what's the word I'm looking for? It needs to the,
it
I
needs
think
to
this is a what
be believable. I think is what you're saying.
yes,
It needs to be believable. You need to be able to read it and think this could happen. And
exactly.
and
And
in my
that's where I was going, is that I've heard it said before that a great mystery, at the end of it, you should look back and say, "Oh, I should have been able to guess that." But
yeah,
thank God I didn't, because, you expertly wove around, but you gave me enough that in hindsight, "Oh,
yeah,
I should have gotten that."
yeah.
Horror is a little different.
It needs to make sense. Like you just
Right.
can't, you just can't. You can't sort of grab some character out of nowhere at the end and say, "Oh, well, it turned out it was this guy who was just
Yeah.
some guy traveling through town and killed everybody." So we didn't even know him until 3 pages from the end. That's not a satisfying read.
Right.
And so that's I think, and of course because my other thrillers, I I like to take ordinary people and put them in extraordinary circumstances. So even more so as you read it, I'm hopeful that you can identify kind of with the main character and think, like what if this happened to me? Well, how would I handle this? What would I do? Because I don't write about ex-CIA guys or Navy SEALs or Jack Reacher type people. My heroes have typically been school teachers or car salesmen or whatever.
So what was the impetus to go with this genre this time? Is this something that you'd been thinking about for a while, and needed the right story, or did you set a challenge for yourself? And
It's funny now looking back, I'm not quite sure when it kind of happened.
yeah.
I mean, about 20 years ago, I had been thinking about a conventional thriller
Hmm.
about some rather disturbed individual who kept wanting to expand his model railway empire. And when the neighbors next door, he went through the wall and he filled their entire apartment or whatever with this. And when they came home, so that he could preserve his masterpiece, he had to kill the people who lived next door so he could keep playing with his trains. And I thought about writing that book at the time, and it just never quite came together.
Yeah.
And a lot of years went by. I think it was in the 90s I was thinking about that book. And so the early 2000s. So it was something along that line was in the back of my head for a long time. And also something that's referenced in the novel Whistle much later on is a true event that happened outside of Toronto in 1979, which there was a major rail disaster, and an entire city of 500,000 people, they were all evacuated for 5 days
Ooh.
because they were afraid that this trainload of chlorine gas tanker cars was going to explode. And if it did, chlorine displaces oxygen, everybody dies. And
Right.
I, as a reporter, worked on that story. And that event had sort of been in the back of my head for a long time. And there's an element of that in Whistle. And so at some point, I mean, a lot of times ideas just sort of come out of the ether. And you just wake up in the morning and there's some really, really cool idea for a book in your head, and you think, where did that come from? And you're not sure, but you're grateful it happened.
Right. Well, that was going to be the next thing I asked you was there's something interesting about well, one question that writers get asked all the time, and I hate this question, is where do your ideas come from? Because that's the most trite thing, because every writer knows that book ideas are everywhere.
Yeah.
Story ideas are, but there's something about that particular idea that just kind of floats a little higher than the rest, or something like you said, that there was an idea, a decade or two or longer, but it just didn't have whatever the thing is that.
I haven't found a way to push itself to the front of my brain, I guess. And when authors get together, and all they do is complain about things, from editors to book tours to everything.
Sure.
They've got their dream job now, the thing they'd always want to do, and now when they get together, they just bitch and moan about it. But
Right.
but our the question that we always think is a big joke is when we get asked, where do the ideas come? Where do you get your ideas? And it's like, well, I get mine at Costco or whatever.
Right.
But I appreciate the question, because if you're not a writer, like, I could easily say, where did Lennon and McCartney come up with all of those great songs? Like, to me, that and Where Elephants Go to Die are like the great mysteries. Like, where did that come from?
Sure.
And so, and I think it's because I can't write music. I don't have any head for that. So I'm like others who don't write, who say, well, where do the ideas come from? Because to them, it's mystifying. And so I understand that. But most of the ideas come from some kind of a prompt that then triggers another idea and that sparks something. I mean, like you mentioned, elevator pitch. I've been listening to the radio one day here in Toronto, where I live, and there's a massive, massive condo tower development down by the waterfront in Toronto. You can't even. It's just. It looks like Hong Kong down there. And there was a story on the radio one day that said that the city cannot keep up with the city's elevator inspectors cannot keep up with the pace of construction. They can't get all these elevators inspected. There had not been a problem, but they just couldn't keep up with it. And I heard that on the radio, and I just instantly, there was this idea: what if you had a serial killer who killed people by sabotaging elevators? That hadn't happened. There was no hit, but it just, something else was like a little lightning rod that just sparked an idea. And so I think those of us who do this for a living, we're kind of waiting for those moments that trigger something. And we just need one a year. That's not asking for much. We just need one of these a year. I did a book a couple of years ago called Take Your Breath Away. And the premise, the opening, was a woman who supposedly had been away from her house long enough to buy some groceries. And she comes home and she comes back to the same address. And the house that's on her property is not the house that was there when she left. And it's a different structure. And she says, she gets out of the car and she says, where's my house? What's happened to my house? And I just loved that opening, but I couldn't figure out how it had come to pass, short of alien abduction or something.
Sure.
And that idea percolated for about 2 or 3 years. And then one day I just sat down and thought, I've got to figure this out. And I just sat down and I wrote down 10 possible sort of reasons why that could have happened. And I found one I liked, and then I did that book. But sometimes ideas just have to cook for a while.
Yeah. Well, with Whistle particularly, this is a different sort of premise and a different sort of delivery. This is a different sort of story, kind of, from the stories that you have told in the past. Like I said, I'm a Linwood Barclay fan. I know what to expect from your books, and when I opened this book, it starts reading like a Linwood Barclay book, and then somewhere along the way, it takes a left turn. And the things that I come to expect from your type of storytelling, you opened me up to a different experience. Was it like that in the writing for you?
No, it was. I mean, I like to think that everything that you would come to expect from my books would still be there. Like I would hope that you'd find the characters interesting, that you find the story has a sense of momentum and it moves. There are twists in it and so forth. So you just get all of that.
Yeah.
But I threw a couple of extra ingredients into the stew, which was the horror and a supernatural element. And to make an inanimate, like a toy, an instrument basically of death. And so that was new. And so I get it, but the way I wrote it, the way I approached it, and sort of tight, quick chapters and all that was the same. What was a little different was when I started writing this. Most of my novels are very quickly paced and usually take place over a period of a very few days.
Mm-hmm.
And I started writing Whistle, thinking that the entire book would take place in the present, but that I had to find a way to introduce information about past events that had happened like 25 years ago. And I kind of reached this moment in the book where I thought, I can't do that. I have to tell the entire story of what happened in the past. So it became, and this was new for me, kind of two novels in one. I needed to write sort of 80 pages in the present, and then I had to go 25 years in the past and write another 80 pages and then come back to the present and go back and forth and do these very large chunks that happened over two different timelines. So that was different for me, and it made it a more ambitious novel than I've done before, and a little bit longer.
How do you manage a writing project like that, where you've got one chunk in one time period, one chunk in another? Do you leave clues for yourself? Do you have a story Bible, so to speak? What's the process of just managing all that information? And I think that the same applies to your thrillers as well, because you're weaving, a cat and mouse game, and is it difficult to manage all that?
I'd love to tell you I have, a big, like a cork board or 100 Post-its and all that support, and I really don't. When I start writing a book, I'll start scribbling ideas in a notebook in pen, and just try to figure out what's going on and who's doing what and so forth. And then after about a week of that, I get bored with that, and I just think I'm just going to start writing this sucker. Once I have a general sense of the big picture, and I have an idea of a beginning, and I have a kind of idea of an ending. I just don't know what's going to happen in what I call the big mushy middle.
Right.
But I have an idea of the engine that's going to drive the story. And so, like the thing about the woman who comes home and there's a different house there, I had to know why that happened before I start writing the book. I had to know that. I have to know the foundation. So then I start working, but I don't have a lot of notes at that point. The big picture is in my head. And occasionally I have to make a little note here or there so that a character named Gordon doesn't turn into George by chapter 9. I've done that, but I don't have reams of notes. I mean, I have friends. For every writer that I know, they work a different way, and I know writers who write like a 80-page outline, have everything mapped out before the end, and then they just write the book having all been, and I can't do that. I just can't. I don't see the opportunities that exist in the book until I get going into it. I'd compare it to, if you get in a car in New York and want to drive to LA, you know where you're going, you know about how long it's going to take.
Yep.
But there are 100 ways to get there. You could just, the route. So I'm kind of like that. I know where I'm going. I know who's driving the car. I know what's under the hood. But hey, maybe we could go over here for a few miles and look at something, and then we could come back.
Yeah. That's the exact analogy that I like to use. Is we get so hung up on this pantsers versus plotters debate, and where do you live? I think the more important question is, do you know how the book ends from the beginning? Because if you know where you're going, like you said, we've got an ultimate destination now. As we trust our creative brain along the way to take little detours, and as long as we ultimately stay on path,
Yeah.
that's kind of the best of both worlds. So, do you know how your stories are going to end?
Pretty usually. And if I don't know immediately, I know fairly early on, I have a kind of sense of how it'll end, or it starts to get clearer and clearer to me as I'm going,
Yeah.
how it's going to end. I think that Whistle, I think I had a pretty good sense of that right from the get go, how I was going to end that book and how it was going to come together. But so I think you need, I think you need to know. It's funny. I was on a panel with an author last year who does it completely differently. He's the one who would do like 50 pages of outline or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, look, like I said, every author does it differently, but it just so happens that my friend here is doing it wrong, and that's, but I mean,
Yeah.
I've talked to so many writers. I mean, I'm pretty sure Michael Connelly has it all planned out. And I've talked to Ian Rankin and others who said, well, I write the book to find out what's going to happen and who did it. And if that works for them, that's great. But I think, I wouldn't start building a house without a set of plans.
Yeah.
And at the very least, I would want to build a really solid foundation. And once the foundation is solid, then I can start building. And and for me, the first draft of a book is putting the house up. I got the house built, the house is standing. But now in a second draft, now I can go back in. I can decide maybe the furniture doesn't go there, or I can paint this room this color, or I can do this, but the structure is solid.
Yeah.
But I can go in now and I can tweak it and do other things with it, whatever I want.
Yeah. In writing Whistle, because there are supernatural elements and the genre is slightly different. Were you ever worried that your traditional readers would not want to go on this journey with you? Does that ever factor?
Yeah, it's funny. I did an event last week, a big event, and we had a sold out crowd. And one woman came up and she says, well, I just don't like supernatural. And then she made this face sort of like this. And I looked at her and said, make that face again. That was great. And yet someone interviewed me actually earlier today and said that they were on Goodreads or somewhere, and they said that a lot of people who had never read me had seen the plot description of Whistle and the supernatural element and said they really wanted to read that. And so maybe I'll lose a handful of readers over here, but I might get more over here.
Right.
And, it's to some degree, every book is a risk because you think, is this really good? Will people read this one even though they read the ones before? And so I think Whistle's more of a risk. But you know what? If it sinks like a stone, I'll write another book next year.
Right.
That's just
and that's some of the benefit of having more than 20 novels published is that there comes a point where I'm a fan of Elevator Pitch or one of your others, but then there comes a point where I'm a fan of Linwood because I've trusted him to take me on this journey before. And even though the journey looks different, I've given you a level of trust that I wouldn't necessarily give to a first-time author that I'm trying out.
And that's gratifying. That's very nice to hear. In fact, that's what, you'll notice I mentioned in the acknowledgements that the first reader of this book was Stephen King. And who's become kind of a friend over the years. And he knew I was writing this. And when I had it done, I said, do you want to read it? And he said, sure. But he didn't want to read it on the screen. I printed it out, put coil on it, and sent it off to him. And I read him at one point saying, I think my publishers might be maybe slightly apprehensive about this new direction. And his feeling was the readers should follow you. That if they like, I wanted to point out to him, but I'm not Stephen King. But his point being that if people like what you write, it's because they like what you write, not because of necessarily what you're writing. They're like you. So the feeling was that they should be willing to take that leap with me.
Yeah. Well, we had a great question come in on the chat. I'm going to pop it up on the screen real quick
Oh,
because this is SK Keating said, did you read anything new or different to prep for or to get inspiration for the supernatural elements? Or was the supernatural easy for you to incorporate, even though it's not common to your other books? That's a great question.
good question. It's more the second half, except like I didn't read anything sort of new to inspire. I just felt, I mean, when I was in my teens, and I was
Mhm.
writing stories since I was about 11 years old. I mean, when I was in my teens, all the short stories I was writing were mostly Twilight Zone inspired or inspired by Ray Bradbury. We were all reading Bradbury as kids, and so
Oh
to
yeah.
sort of jump into that element, and I watched plenty of movies and stuff. So I didn't feel any need to do any kind of research and reading of the genre. I didn't feel like I was stepping into a new. It wasn't like I was going to learn how to play the piano and never played the piano before. So.
Right.
But the only thing I read again, which I had read years ago, was I reread Stephen King's novel Needful Things,
Mhm.
because I remember that it had a kind of a evil proprietor of a little shop, when there's an element of that in Whistle, and I reread it, not partly for inspiration, but also so I didn't want my book to be too much like it, So I wanted to
Mhm.
make sure I didn't have too many elements that were similar. And that's a great book, by the way. And so, no, I mean, I spent 4 seasons of Evil. What more do you need?
Right. Right. Oh man. There's I love to hear about the tools that writers have collected in their writer toolbox. You spent quite a bit of time as a journalist,
Right.
as in the newspaper business, and that adds a certain set of tools to your toolbox. Even though you're writing nonfiction,
Yeah.
we hope the news we get is nonfiction. But if you're reporting on an incident, say you're in a big city and a thing happens, and maybe there are 5 different news organizations, 5 different people are going to show up to cover this event, but they're all going to see it a little differently
Mm.
because of their perspective and because of the things that catch their eye, whatever. And then you tell that story. Though things that you pick up there add certain things to your toolbox that you then, when you're writing fiction, you can kind of lean on a little bit. Were there things that you picked up from in your time working for the newspaper that you bring into your fiction writing?
Yeah, I spent yeah, that's true. I sort of quickly. So I spent a couple of years in a small daily in Ontario, Peter Examiner, and I was in a small suburban paper for 2 years, and then I joined Canada's largest circulation paper, which is the Toronto Star, in 1981, and as a space spent, all told, almost nearly 3 decades in newspapers, and a couple of things that come out of that. One is working at a newspaper, and half of my time at the Toronto Star was as an editor on news desks and writing headlines. Working at a newspaper is like getting a crash course in the world. So you just start learning all these things that you don't even know you're learning them. One day you cover a trial, the next day you cover a hospital board meeting, and now you're interviewing some celeb coming into town with a new book or something. So you just start working on everything. And so when it comes to sitting down to writing a book, you think, well, I kind of know about that, and I kind of know about this. So you just kind of know stuff that you've soaked up. And the
Yeah.
other thing that it ingrained in me was the importance of deadlines. That deadlines are sacred in newspapers. I mean, a deadline is everything.
Right.
I mean, those presses don't wait. Those presses start rolling at a given time. And if your story's not ready, that's too bad. The paper's going, and it's going to go off the press. It's going to go in a truck, and it's going to be in a box. And so if you don't meet your deadline, it's not happening. This is before 24-hour news cycles and so forth.
Sure.
But deadlines
Yeah.
mean everything. So those two things were hugely ingrained into me. As far as actual stories, there's a story that I worked on that kind of works its way into my novel Bad Move, that I was personally had dealt with one, and but there aren't and the environment of a newspaper shows up in 2 or 3 of my novels, but actual stories that I might have worked on, not much has worked its way into my books. But it's the trade and it's the discipline of working in newspaper that taught me everything. I mean, I love to do a whole sort of rant when I'm at events about writer's block. You know, that how absolutely precious and adorable we are as writers, that we have a condition for just not doing our work. You know, like there's no plumber's block, there's no dishwasher's block, but oh, you're a writer, you're special. You know, you don't have to. We understand, and you can't have writer's block at a newspaper.
Right.
That doesn't work. And so we all have days where we don't feel like it. You know what I mean? Like we just can't get it together. But that's just human nature. But as far as I'm concerned, when I have a book to do, I sit down and I have to get to work. And so it's a job. I think that's what newspapers taught me more than anything. Is writing is not some sort of romantic sort of endeavor and you know, waiting for the muse to strike and all that crap. It's a job.
Yeah. Well, since you brought up writer's block, and I 100% agree with you that there's doing the work and then there's, you know, being precious about it, whatever. But the reality is that sometimes things are going on in life and you know, whatever it is, and it's hard to settle your brain. It's hard to connect with the thing. Are there some strategies that you've developed along the way that help you to clear out and to, you know, flip the sign on the door, if you will, that, you know, the writer is in, now it's time to get to business?
You know, and as I say, I think what you're saying applies to all professions.
Sure.
For me, if I'm having a bit of trouble with, like, I just can't, you know, in a thriller, all the dominoes need to fall in a certain way at the end of it.
Right.
Sometimes it's like, how am I going to make it? What happens to happen first? How does this work? And it used to be what I would do is I would go cut the lawn, and that worked really well until we were away a lot and we got a lawn service. So that was the end of that. And it was like, I can hire this guy to cut the grass, but I can't hire him to figure out my plot problem.
Right.
So I couldn't do that. Sometimes it's going for a drive. Sometimes just going for a walk. It's just sometimes the best thing to do is just walk away. Just walk away and do something else. Go down to the basement, run some trains, go for a walk, go to a movie. And when you are not thinking about it, the solution presents itself. But if you try to solve it while you're staring at the screen, that often is not going to work. You just have to walk away for a while.
Yeah.
But I don't even call that writer's block. I just call that part of the job.
Exactly. And I think the important thing that you hit on there is that that the more you write, the more you do the job, you learn to trust that your mind can work out the problem if given the space and like you said, sometimes staring at the screen is never going to happen. But I know if I go for a walk, if I take my dog out and just allow myself to not think about it, my brain is trained to chew on those stories in the background and give me the answer. And you just have to learn to trust that.
I mean, this is the stupidest example, but sometimes I'll kill time. I'll play some Scrabble on my phone and I don't see any good word. And I put my phone down and then I pick it up a half an hour later and look, it's just there. I see it instantly. I see the perfect word that will fit. Or so I think it's just sometimes when you get too close to something and you just need a bit of space, you just need a break. And that can be just, you know, it can be short or it can be long, but that's just, I think, the nature of creativity.
Yeah.
You know, you just have to go for a walk and it'll come.
Yeah. In writing thrillers, you talked about this earlier, that, you know, there's a grounded nature to thrillers and to mysteries where, you know, the dominoes, you know, this needs to do this to do that. When you're dealing with supernatural elements, you know, though you may think on the surface, well, all the rules are off. I can do anything that I want to do. And to a point, yes, you can have things that don't normally make sense, but there is such a thing as going so far that you just lose the reader. how do you think about that? And like what rules do you allow yourself to break because it's supernatural? And where do you draw the lines?
Well, like I say, it was a bit liberating to write Whistle because I could do different things that I didn't necessarily have to account for. I mean, in Whistle, people start hearing train whistles in the night when there's no operating railway track nearby. Well, that kind of is creating the atmosphere and sort of getting across the effect of this entity or whatever it is that's causing this. So in the real world, you won't hear a train whistle if there's no train track nearby. But in the context of this kind of book, you can do that. And so that was just to some degree kind of liberating when I wrote this, because I could break some rules and do things that can't really happen. Mm-hmm. But I think in the context of any genre that you're writing, you have to play by some rules. You have to be able to still justify to some degree, well, okay, that was crazy weird, but why did it happen? How could it have happened in the context of this book? And I would like to think that I was able to work within those guidelines.
I think that the key that you said is within the context of this book. What rules have the world that you've established? What is possible?
I don't know why.
Don't break the what is possible.
I mean, I don't know why I thought of this now, but I mean, I love the movie The Shining, and right in the very end of The Shining, when what's her face? I can't think of the actress, but Jack's wife, Shelley Duvall. Running through the house, and she starts seeing these images of all these sort of really bizarre things that are happening in the house. And I think, okay, some of those felt like they were just kind of thrown in. They're just shocking. But the rest of the movie, the weird stuff, it didn't make sense in the context of that. But then the director wants to do a couple of little flourishes and just throw in something that's just wild. And you sort of think, okay, let's have some fun. But to some degree, you think, okay, that was just done for effect, but it didn't really fit into the whole context of the book. Did that make any sense?
Yeah.
It's just, if you can go too far.
Right.
Not that you have to pull back, but you can go as far as you want, as long as you don't lose your audience, as long as your audience doesn't go, oh, come on. Like, I was with you up here, but now you've just sort of like, I'm out. You know what I mean? I'm just out.
Yeah. Another great question from SK. How do you keep the thrill going? What do you need to change about a scene to accelerate the excitement? And I'll just tack onto this that you talked about that mushy middle or muddy middle earlier. When you hit those kind of the doldrums and, you're going over here, you've been here, but, we need to breach this territory. Are there things that you do to keep the reader turning that page?
Well, the most important person is to keep sort of turning the page is me.
Sure.
And if I'm getting bored writing it, then for sure you'll be bored reading it. And so I have to keep myself interested. And I kind of, I like to have twists in a book, and I like to have lots of little mini twists, so that at the end of each chapter, if you're writing a chapter, you think, well, what is the most logical way for this chapter to end? And is there a way that I could make that not happen? Can I tack something on just at the end of this chapter, just enough that you go, whoa, that's cool, and keep going? And so that's kind of it. I try to keep any kind of revelations at the end of chapters, and not put them in the middle, so that the book has a sense of momentum. I mean, I'm a kid of the 60s who grew up just glued to television. Yeah. And for me, chapter breaks are commercial breaks. Yeah. And so, the first act and the second act of an hour-long drama, you ended that first one, and that first commercial starts and something dramatic happens. So you go, whoa, and now you run to the fridge, you get a snack, and you come back, and you get back in time for act two. And so chapter breaks are commercial breaks. And so my inspiration is television. Every segment has to end with something that is interesting enough that or teases you, so you've got to come back.
Yeah. It doesn't matter how good your plot is or how good your supernatural elements are in a story. If you don't have characters that the reader can latch onto and love and root for, ultimately, Annie Blunt is one of those characters. What a fantastic character. And you are not nice to Annie. Where did she come from? And, how do you start thinking about bringing these characters into the story?
So the book kind of has two main characters, that one in one time period, one in the other. And the one in the present is Annie Blunt, who is a children's author and illustrator. And she was just born to do this kind of thing, and she's got these series of books about this adorable little penguin named Pierce. And I think Annie was inspired by Ian Faulkner, who used to do, he's no longer with us, but did a lot of New Yorker covers. He created this little piglet character named Olivia for a children's series books that are so adorable that my wife has every one of them. And I think that maybe Annie's a kind of pulling in of a lot of personal things. I mean, I'm a writer, Annie's a writer, but my father was an illustrator, worked in advertising, and Annie's an illustrator. And Annie has Annie's been put through a lot. Something in one of her books that seemed innocent enough has inspired a child to do something that ended in a horrific tragedy. And on top of that, she's lost her husband. And so, Annie's this wonderful person, but she's immersed in grief. And that's why she grabs, her 10-year-old son, Charlie, and says, we're getting out of the city. We're going to rent this house out in the country and try to get our life back together after this horrible tragedy. And it's at this house where young Charlie finds this old tied detergent newspaper in a cardboard box full of old toy trains. And not long after that, Annie starts hearing those whistles in the night. And Annie finds herself drawing not her cute, adorable penguin, but this creepy wolf rat-like creature, and wonders, where in the heck is that coming from? But I think Annie herself is one of my best creations, best characters. And I also have a great fondness for a police chief, that's Harry, who's the police chief in the other segments of the book that take place about 2.5 decades ago. And I hope that's what makes the book strong, is that those Annie and Harry, they're two very strong characters.
Yeah. Those characters are, they're everything to the story. And, do you ever find yourself writing a book and you think, oh, I've got a great hook for it, I've got a great plot, but the characters just not resonating with you? Has that ever happened to you?
It did happen actually a bit with Whistle, as funnily enough. It doesn't happen too often, but with Whistle, I had I took the first stab I took at it. Annie was, instead of female, was a male character, and that character was married, and they had a son, and they went and rented this house that had the trains in it and so forth, and it wasn't working for me, and so I decided to scrap all of that, and I wanted to change the nature of that character, and that doesn't happen too often. What can happen sometimes is I just haven't got maybe a strong enough setup, or the plot, is the problem. For me, the biggest thing in starting a book is the what if. I need that. I know a lot of authors, idea comes out of a character, and mine come out of a situation. What if you came back and the house you lived in was gone? What if you woke up one morning and your family was missing? I mean, so I kind of start with that. And then if I find that I can figure out an interesting set of circumstances that brought us to that what if, then I've got something I can work with.
Love it. Whistle is available everywhere now. It's been out for a week now. Linwood, I absolutely love this book, like I've said, and it is a journey that I was not expecting, but I'm so glad that I took. if folks are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, your fantastic back catalog, news coming up, and that sort of thing, what is a good place for them to find you? And
they can find me at linwoodbarclay.com is my website, but they can find me. There's a Linwood Barclay Facebook author page. I'm on X, not quite as much as I used to be, but I'm on X and Blue Sky and Threads. I'm now on Instagram. I can't figure it out. I really need to work on Instagram. My wife's on it all the time because our son is an artist and does things. She's always looking seriously, and she'll say, "Oh, look at this really great thing on Instagram." By the time she hands the phone to me, it's gone. Where did it go? I don't know where it went. It just goes. I can't figure it out. Anyway, but apparently my publishers on my behalf will post things on Instagram.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll find all those links and we'll put them in the show notes to make it easier for folks to find you. Whistle, available everywhere now. Go grab a copy. Go visit your local bookstore. Pick up a copy. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put links to it in the show notes where you can grab it from Amazon.
I have to brag. I was a great thrill. Last week, Whistle was People Magazine's Book of the Week. I was
incredible.
I was impossible to live with that.
Did you have to put some grease on the side of your head to fit through the door? And
pretty much. I just had to stay out of the house for a while because I couldn't fit through any sort of opening.
I understand. Well, congratulations, and I hope that it continues to resonate with readers. There's something about the sunny, happy time of year where we kind of want to gravitate toward a dark book, and
Yeah, I think so. I think that maybe in tough times, that it's nice to dive into a world that's even worse, but that people can come out the other end into
right.
Good,
Yeah, there's something about reading horrific things from the safety of your reading chair.
I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, Linwood, thank you for joining us, and thanks for this fantastic conversation.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.